Good afternoon. Welcome to episode one of the Wilson Center Canada Institute's Canadian Election Series 2025. I'm Xavier Delgado with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, joined by my colleague Madison Lipson, Research Associate, and Canada Institute Global Fellow and Chief Data Scientist at Nanos Research, Mr. Nik Nanos. Nik, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to join both of you for this chit chat about Canada and the election. How's that for drama?
Well, I feel like, Nick, we've been talking about a Canadian election coming up for well over a year. At least we know the opposition's been calling for it. But the day is finally here. It's just we have a different prime minister now and a different lead of the Liberal Party. The polls have completely upended. There's
Yeah.
a new president in Washington, and it seems like nobody knows what's going to happen. But I'm hoping today for the first episode, we can actually back up and talk a little bit about how we got to this point. Now, at the time of recording, today is Wednesday, March 19th. The writs haven't dropped yet, so there's been no formal election called. But it seems like we're getting awfully close to that. But Nick, can you help? Let's just start from the very beginning. Back us up a little bit. Take us maybe all the way back 2021 when the prime minister won another minority government before he made his deal with the NDP for supply and confidence. Walk us through it. How did we get to where we are today?
Well, the thing is that whether you like or don't like the guy, Justin Trudeau formed three governments starting in 2015. It had a majority, then a minority government, and then another minority government. And as you know, in Canada, because we're a parliamentary democracy, when you're a minority government, usually you don't have enough votes to pass legislation on your own. You need to work with someone or a group of members of parliament outside of your party in order to pass legislation. And for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, their parliamentary partner were the New Democrats. So think of the Liberals as kind of like a progressive party. And I would say we should consider the New Democrats kind of like social democrats, left, except much more left than the social democrats in Germany. So think of two progressive parties kind of teaming up and agreeing on different legislation in order to kind of stay in power. And the thing is usually these minority governments don't last very long, right? Because they just don't have the votes. In this particular case, it was a fairly stable minority government. And but the thing is that with the Liberals, they'd been in power since 2015, and they were just looking tired. It was like time for a change. People had seen the Liberals in for a long time. Justin Trudeau was looking tired. He was a bit of a lightning rod. He did stuff like increase the capital gains tax. Very few businesses like that. He did other stuff like a carbon tax, which increased the cost of gasoline, increased the cost of natural gas, the cost to heat your home, all that kind of stuff. Very controversial because they're trying to advance an environmental agenda. But the thing is, people are still trying to pay for the bills. And as a result, by the end of the mandate, like at the end of 2024, the last weekend of 2024, we were doing tracking. The Liberals were like at 20% support. The Conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, were at 47%. 27-point advantage for the Conservatives. And at that time, it looked like Justin Trudeau was going to stick on and stay and run. And he's telling everybody he wanted to run against the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. And funny thing happened. He got knifed by his Minister of Finance, the Deputy Prime Minister. It would be like the Vice President deciding, oh, you know what? I don't like the president anymore, and I'm going to try to derail the presidency. That's basically what happened in Canada. Created a situation because the numbers weren't good where Justin Trudeau stepped down. And then as three things happened. Justin Trudeau stepped down, and then people are like, hey, maybe I'll be open to voting Liberal. That was one event. Another event, very important, Donald Trump talking about tariffs in the 51st state. Third event, Mark Carney and the Liberal leadership and him winning the Liberal leadership. Roll all those things up. And what was once a 27-point advantage, 47-20 for the Conservatives, is now a dead heat, basically a statistical coin toss between the Conservatives and the Liberals.
Wow. Well, down here in America, we wouldn't know anything about political parties getting rid of their leader and candidate right before a big election, right, Maddie? Uh, but,
No.
but Nick, I do want to focus on one point here, which is the timeline. It took almost a decade for the liberal support to crater to a position where it felt like we get a conservative or other party government, and just 2 months for that lead to diminish to basically, as you said, a dead heat. Is that not slightly remarkable or abnormal for Canadian politics and polling?
Yeah, it doesn't happen. It's very rare for the numbers to swing like this. But I think a lot of this has to do with, the reality of all those things in succession. It's never one thing that changes a trend line. It takes multiple things. And I think the combination of Trudeau's resignation, combination of Donald Trump putting a focus on the binational relationship, combination of the Liberal leadership, and now Mark Carney being elected, all those things. Now, that said, today's trend is not what will happen tomorrow. So we have to make this very clear. You might think, hey, the Conservatives have messed up. No, they haven't messed up. It's just that the last 6 to 8 weeks have really favored the Liberals because they've basically been in the news because they are the government. They're the folks that are responding to the White House and the administration on the Canada-US file. So they had a bit of a, I won't call it a free ride, but a lot of coverage. When we hit the election, which will be probably called within the next number of days, it's like a reset because in Canada, we have a tradition. Actually, I think it's mandated by the government. That's how much of a government place that we are, that media outlets have to give equal coverage or similar coverage to kind of the main parties. So as soon as the election is called, Pierre Poilievre will now have as much coverage as Mark Carney, the leader of the Liberal Party, even though he is prime minister, but he will be given, the two will have equal coverage. And that's when we're going to really know, is it still time for a change and people still hate the Liberals? Or are they looking at different issues to judge the two frontrunners?
And to understand how that's going to play out, I think we gotta have to understand the mind of the voter right now. Nick, can you tell us a little bit about what voters are worried about? What are the top issues that they're going to be thinking about when they go to the polls?
Yeah, here's the interesting part. Canadians and Americans are basically worried about the same thing. How are we going to pay for our bills? Where are jobs going to come from? Worried about the cost of housing, the cost of groceries and stuff like that. Worried about uncertainty around the world. And what we've seen in Canada, we measure consumer confidence for Bloomberg News in Canada, is that forward views on the future strength of the Canadian economy have hit a low that we haven't seen since the pandemic. So think of the environment today as uncertain in terms of the future, and people don't know how long that uncertainty will last. Does that sound familiar? That was the pandemic. It's kind of like people were locked up or locked down or whatever, and people were wondering, what does this mean? And how long will it last? Well, we have numbers right now. The Canadian consumer confidence right now is very similar in terms of negativity to where it was during the pandemic. And when we look at polling in the United States, and we look at, say, for example, the Michigan Confidence Index, which is kind of one of the world standards for kind of measuring consumer confidence, they're seeing the same thing. Americans think that inflation is going to rise. They're worried about uncertainty right now, much more so than they were 3, 4 months ago.
Well, it's funny, Nick, that you say that because it seems like while there's this heavy anxiety about the economy, my perception is that there's also a rise in nationalism, wrapping yourself in the flag. It can't all just be because Canada won the Four Nations face-off, right? There has to be something else driving this. Are you seeing that in the trend lines as well?
Yeah, actually, there's a combination of factors. So overlaying all of this is the binational relationship in among Canadians, right? So they're wondering, what does this mean? What will this mean to the cost of groceries in Canada? What will this mean to the cost of, buying a car in Canada? What will this mean for our jobs? And that level of anxiousness about finances has really been amped up, especially over the 4 weeks, because, people don't know. Actually, this might sound weird. It almost might be better to have tariffs in place and for there to be some type of certainty to say, okay, this is how things are going to work on a go forward basis, as opposed to the uncertainty that we've seen over the last number of weeks. But, for Canadians, we have to remember 90% of Canadians live within a 1 hour drive of the American border. Canadians have always been focused on the United States. The United States is and remains our most important trading partner, our most important ally, and an important neighbor. We share a lot of values. So whatever happens in the U.S., Canadians pay attention. And I think based on what's been coming out of the White House, there are a lot of Canadians going like, what's up with this? And, I think if you'd ask an average Canadian, it's like, okay, like this is a world where Vladimir Putin's getting telephone calls. Like they even talked about having a hockey game between the Russians and the Americans. It's just completely offensive to any Canadian, right? It's kind of like you want to play hockey with the Russians and then you're slapping tariffs on us. Like it's like a bizarro world for for many Canadians. But I think the reality is that Donald Trump and the binational relationship will probably be the defining issue, and worry about the bills and jobs all fall under that. In a way, in 1988, we had the free trade election where Canadians voted as to whether they wanted to have free trade at that time just with the United States. And in 1988, it was a very hot election, a lot of debate about the future of the country and free trade. And Canadians decided to give a majority, big mandate to the Conservatives to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, then Ronald Reagan, and George Bush won. But the thing is, that's going to be the big overhang in this election. So they're going to be looking at parties. They might not even like the party. They might not even like the leader, but they're just going to be wondering who is the person that can best help Canada navigate the current administration and bring some sort of stability to the binational relationship, at least from a Canadian perspective.
And Nik, are there other international kind of events that are going on that are changing or playing into the polling with Canadians as well?
Yeah, well, it's what's happening in the Ukraine, the war between Russia and Ukraine, also what's happening in the Middle East, and what I'll say tension between China and Taiwan. It's kind of like everything's going wrong, right? It's like the Middle East is, there are terrible things happening in the Middle East. There's war, right, on the border of Europe between Ukraine and Russia. China is looking at Taiwan. And why don't we just throw in, we have an administration that believes that tariffs is a good policy, at least in terms of American interests, that it's a good economic policy. So, to your point, Maddie, it's like everything is going wrong and nothing is going right right now. And, the interesting thing is that Canadians that are under 35 years of age are the most pessimistic about the future right now. And I think it's because we should add on top of that people struggling to pay for the bills, people being underemployed or unemployed, people worried about climate change, young people worried about climate change. So it's kind of like there's no good news, either domestic or international right now.
So going off that, then, we're seeing now that the Liberal Party is in a statistical tie with the Conservatives. What challenges kind of remain for the Liberal Party to kind of continue to capitalize on this momentum? And do you feel that these polls are accurately reflecting a change in kind of who they want to vote for? In the United States, very close to the election, they thought that the Democrats were polling much better than they did. And we saw during the election in 2016 as well that the numbers were actually significantly different after the election. So
yeah. We do have to say that the pollsters in the United States actually did an excellent job in the last US election because they all basically predicted a dead heat in terms of popular support. It's the uncertainty of the Electoral College. And, in Canada, it's kind of the same. There's the popular vote, but who really cares about the popular vote? Because it all comes down to a first past the post system and how much that popular vote converts into seats. In the last two federal elections, the Liberals actually, for all intents and purposes, lost the popular vote. Actually, they did lose the popular vote, but they were able to form more seats because they won a whole bunch of seats by like this much all the way across, and they were able to form a government. But the thing is that what we're looking at is an environment. I think we shouldn't think of it in terms of the Liberals having momentum and stuff like that. I think we should think in terms of uncertainty and volatility, because when the numbers swing so fast in a short period of time, they can swing back because these aren't really firm opinions. And this is where, because the relationship between Canada and the United States is so important from an economic perspective and a security perspective. And when I say security as a NATO ally, having, NORAD, things like NORAD and defending the continent, and, the Canadian Armed Forces working in tandem with the U.S. military. Everybody's really fixated on this. So I think we should all buckle up for a really volatile election. I think what we're going to see is day to day, the two main contenders, conservative Pierre Poilievre and the liberal Mark Carney, basically in the hot seat on what are you going to do? How are you going to manage the Canada-US relationship? How are we going to move forward on this? And them also responding to whatever President Trump says on a particular day. So they'll really be in the crucible. There'll be like a pressure cooker for them. Like they'll be making speeches and President Trump will say something during their speech. And I would imagine that journalists will rightly say, hey, President Trump has just said this. What do you think about that? And it'll be a real test. So I'm expecting a lot of volatility and perhaps more swings in public opinion. I think it's really too early to tell whether, what will happen will favor the conservatives or the liberals.
Nick, for all the talk we've had here today, our American audience might think there's only two political parties in Canada. In fact, that's not true at the federal level. Can you tell us a little bit about the other parties, where they've gone? Where's the NDP or the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party and the People's Party?
Well, there you go. So, the thing is the NDP, so think of the conservatives and the liberals tied at around 35, 36 each. The New Democrats, which are kind of the social democrats that are very left-wing, especially even by American standards, like way up there. They're at around 15, 16%. So they're not really challengers. They've never won a federal election. They've done well in state elections or the equivalent of provinces, but not that. And then we have the Bloc Québécois. We have to remember we have a separatist party in Quebec. And you know what? They usually do very well. They've got the easiest job in town. There's like, we want to be our own country and we're advocating for Quebec. No one expects them to win a national election. And their leader, Blanchard, is very credible and very steady. He performs quite well during the election. There's the Green Party, which has kind of vacillated in importance, more important in Western Canada, specifically British Columbia, than in other parts of the country. And the Greens are usually at anywhere from 3 to 6%. The People's Party was, I'll call it like a further right-wing party, more of a populist right-wing party, led by a former Conservative cabinet minister, Maxime Bernier, also known as Mad Max. That's his nickname. He likes the nickname. But they're only at around 2 to 3 to 4%. So, there are other parties, but right now, I think there's going to be laser focus on the two frontrunners, the liberals and the conservatives, as people try to decide who they want to lead the country to kind of navigate the binational relationship.
And I want to seize on something that you spoke about earlier, which is that young people are very worried about their future. It's going to inform their voting decisions. Can you take us a little bit, pull back the curtain and talk about who's supporting each of these major candidates? What demographics are they pulling and how that changed since recent elections?
Yeah, Xavier, this is really interesting what's happened. So in 2015, for anybody that follows Canadian politics, Justin Trudeau was elected. He was a young guy, talked about sunny ways, talked about legalizing marijuana, cannabis. Boy, a lot of young people were excited about the change because he was very positive and very progressive. They bought into it. He won a sweeping majority, a lot of it with young people. And the Liberals, why don't we say if we look at the last 10 years, for the last 7 years, the Liberals actually did really well among young voters and the Conservatives not well. It's kind of like the Conservatives, more older folks. But since the pandemic was really a bit of a dividing point from a generational point of view when we look at the numbers. Since the pandemic, where many young people were on the front lines in terms of being in the hospitality industry, their lives were disrupted. If they're going to college or university, they didn't have the same type of experience because of schools being closed down and kind of locked down and not being able to do a lot of the things that are part of the college university experience. And also with interest rates going up, stresses in the housing market, stresses on inflation going up, young people have actually been the most hardest hit from all of those factors. And what we saw was two things. young people drifting away from the liberals who they were with for 7 of the last 10 years, drifting away, and about 2/3 of them moving towards the conservatives. It's kind of like, hey, I can't pay for the groceries. Uh, and then about 1/3 actually going to the New Democrats, like further left, because they're impatient with the liberals not being able to deliver on their progressive agenda. So we're seeing a world now where younger people are more likely to vote for the conservatives and then the New Democrats. The liberals, in a lot of the tracking, come third among young voters, and they used to have a lock on young voters. So we've seen those big kind of demographic changes when it comes to who young people would give a tip of the hat to from a political perspective.
It's fascinating, Nick, because we see this dynamic as well in the United States, at least from what I can see. Um, Barack Obama came in with a very young voter base in 2008. And slowly we've seen the Republican Party and Donald Trump build up their base of support amongst young voters, especially amongst young men. So fascinating trends on both sides of the border. Going to pass it to Maddie for one more question here.
Yeah, so we have all this information, Nick, what's next? What are the next steps? What's important going forward? And especially for Americans, what's the process? Canada they have a date that they have to have the election by, but they don't have election Tuesday like we do. So
No,
what are the next steps?
exactly. Well, here's we have a fixed election date, but it's more like a best before date, kind of election must be called. If a sitting government gets defeated in the House on a money bill and loses the confidence of the House, then the government's defeated and there's an election. In this particular case, what we're seeing is a government, in this particular case, the Mark Carney government, which is like 7 days old or thereabouts, will go to the Governor General to ask for an election. So he will trigger the election. So he won't call back the House of Commons to get a punch in the face by Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives and get defeated. He's going to proactively call an election, and the election, which could have been much later, like it was expected to be in the fall, will now happen, in the spring, all things being equal. So expect that. And then you know what? I think we should be looking at the Trump timetable. April 2nd will be a big day in the Canadian election. The thing is that all the parties will be able to prepare for that day because they know that it's going to be a big day in terms of the binational relationship. One of the interesting things in the polling, and I think this is really important, is that, when we ask Canadians how they'd like Canada to respond to tariff threats, and, the responses include negotiating, doing dollar for dollar retaliation, capitulating, doing nothing. When we asked this question in the first Trump administration, because if you remember, there were tariffs threatened in the first Trump administration, Canadians said overwhelmingly, or much more likely to say, they wanted to negotiate it and have discussions and work things out. Fast forward, when we asked the exact same question in Trump 2, Canadians now are much more likely to want to retaliate and have dollar for dollar tariffs. So the interesting thing right now is that the provincial premiers agree with retaliation generally. The Liberals agree with retaliation, as do the Conservatives. So there's a bit of a political consensus. The real kicker here is that Canadians know that we will suffer. They don't think that, hey, it's going to be easy, we'll just retaliate and everything will be okay. There's a significant proportion of Canadians go, you know what? We're not going to win. We can't win against the United States, and we will suffer. And it's kind of like, it is what it is. So look at those milestones on the binational relationship, and those will be critical junctures in the Canadian federal election.
Well, Nik Nanos, a fantastic roadmap of how we got here and where we're going. I want to thank you for joining us at the Wilson Center. And if you're watching this and you want to tune into more content, stay looped with the Canada Institute. We're going to be doing more coverage like this as the election drags on. For now, I'm Xavier Delgado with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, joined by my colleague Madison Lipson. Thank you for watching.